Hi, yes, good morning. I'm actually in the East Coast of the United States, and so it's morning over here. And I'm just delighted to be with you today. I do have slides and I do have a presentation, but I am really looking forward to a bit of dialogue and questions at the end. So I'll try to make sure that this presentation doesn't take too long, because it would be nice to get to meet all of you and hear some of your thoughts. So what I will do is share my screen. Hopefully this will give you an idea of what the slides look like. And so one of the big questions that I was asked when asked to give this talk is, why does the Red Cross Red Crescent movement work on climate? So I work for something that is called the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, right? So this is what we do. We work on climate. And and I think it's a good question, right? Why are we doing this? And I'd love to take you through a little bit of what we work on, a little bit of what I work on, and leave you with some points. My understanding is that most of you do research, or if not all of you, and so I'll leave you with some agenda points from our side about really areas where we see the need for more research. We'd love to collaborate with all of you on any of these topics. So to start, the Red Cross Red Crescent movement is a global movement, right? So every country has their own Red Cross or Red Crescent National Society, and we're really the work on the ground that happens after a disaster is done by volunteers. We have 17 million volunteers and 80 million members, and so our mandate is to be impartial and to be neutral, but to essentially respond to need where it happens. So in the aftermath of disaster in most cases. So the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center then is a little bit of we are a reference center within the wider Red Cross Red Crescent movement. And our work is to help think about needs often before they happen, right? So the Red Cross, most disaster managers come in post-disaster. If there is a flood, they come in post-flood to do response, right? To help people find temporary shelter, temporary things that they can eat, make people comfortable and help them recover from the disaster. At the Climate Center, we've said, well, look, you need to be looking a little bit more broadly at risk, right? So what we do is we push what we call climate risk management in the humanitarian sector. And we work within the Red Cross Red Crescent, but also with other humanitarian partners, the UN, and anyone who you'd think of is probably active in this space. We usually will partner with them and look at climate risk management. And so a lot of this means, can we understand how risk changes over time? What are the risks today? And what might we need to do right now to reduce the risks today? How is climate change potentially changing those risks, or has already changed them? And maybe people aren't even necessarily aware that they're at higher risk of flooding or heat waves in a particular location. And what kind of tools can we use to help people anticipate those risks and prevent some of the impacts of disaster? So this can be in the long term when it comes to climate change adaptation, but also in the short term. And so a lot of our work is on early warning systems, for example, for climate-related events. So I'd love to take you through, that's actually a lot of my work, is how to set up early warning systems and some of the exciting innovations that we've had over the last few years in this space. So we've been pushing early warning, early action for a long time. With climate change, you could imagine that extreme events are projected to increase in most parts of the world. And these extreme events are very, very dangerous. But in most cases, even if we do see more floods in Boston, or we do see more droughts in Zimbabwe or wherever, these particular events can be predicted before they happen. So I might not know now that we're going to see, 7 floods and these exact dates in the future in Boston, but what I can say is, if we're going to see more floods, let's set up an early warning system so that when they do come, people are prepared, people can evacuate, and we don't see the level of devastation that we would see if those happened without warning. The problem is that people talk about early warning all the time. Early warning, early action, you know, we wrote a report in like 2009 about how amazing this is and how the Red Cross needs to do it. Wonderful, and everyone agrees. But then in reality, when we get early warnings, sometimes we don't even get them. And when we get them, often we don't really do anything because it's, you know, everyone's like, you know, what does this warning mean? So one of the innovations that we've put forward in the last few years is something we're calling forecast-based financing. So here are just, I'll leave you with two examples. In 2010, there were major floods in Pakistan that killed many, many people. And these floods were predicted before they happened. And there were some, you know, interesting research articles post-event showing that the event not only could have been predicted, but was actually predicted on global models somewhere. But yet we still did see major devastation and loss of life. In 2011, you're probably very familiar with the famine that happened in Somalia. Again, this is a very well-studied event because it was predicted before it happened. And there were many, many warnings, you know, not only of the rains failing, but of the food security situation deteriorating before the ultimately famine was declared. And so, you know, there's a big question here about why are we not doing enough when we hear early warnings of extreme events? So forecast-based financing is an innovation that I've been working on for a number of years to try to answer this question, right? Why are early warnings not turning into enough action? And our hypothesis is that there are several barriers. And if we can break down some of these barriers and set up systems that expect early action, then we should see more early action. So there are two major things that we've set up with forecast-based financing. The first is funding. The Red Cross typically only gets funding once a disaster happens. If there is a flood, we run news advertisements, we talk to governments, and we get lots of donations, and we use those donations to respond to the people who are affected by the flood. If the flood hasn't happened yet, there is no money to respond. And so this has been a little bit of a catch-22 for the humanitarian sector, and it's a funny, awkward problem. So we've said, okay, forecast-based financing, we would like to put funding aside so that it is available pre-disaster based on a forecast that is strong enough to indicate that a disaster is likely to happen. So this has been the first innovation that we've put forward. And the second is having a plan. What we found was that when people received a forecast, I mean, Somalia is a very good case of this. There were lots and lots of meetings that happened when we had all these forecasts of the deteriorating situation. And people had a meeting and they had another meeting and they had another meeting, but it wasn't clear who should do what. And this is particularly true for fast onset disasters like flooding, for example. So if you have a forecast that in the next 5 days, there's likely to be a big flood, it's not clear who should do what, who should be evacuating which people and where should they go, and is this forecast strong enough to even merit evacuation? Or should we wait a few days for the forecast to get more certain? And so answering these questions in advance, saying, here's the plan, here are the roles and responsibilities of all the different actors, here's what we expect, is the other component of forecast-based financing. So we're essentially changing the default, saying when you receive the early warning, there is a plan and we expect you to take action. And maybe, of course, in the moment, you do additional actions or different actions because they make more sense, but you had a plan and we expected you to take action. And obviously now there can be some culpability if you don't, which is exciting within forecast-based financing. So I'd love to report that we've actually had quite a bit of success in this. So we have set up a fund. This is the schematic of this fund that we've set up in Geneva. So there is a fund already in Geneva that pays out rapidly based on post-disaster. It's called the DREF, the Disaster Relief Emergency Fund for the Red Cross. And so post-disaster, people can receive this grant, or whatever, National Red Cross, Red Crescent societies can receive this grant, not people. And so we have set up a window so that they are now eligible to receive this based on a trigger, an early action trigger that's essentially a forecast. So, for example, if there is a greater than 50% chance of a forecast of high water levels on the Brahmaputra River in Bangladesh, then Bangladesh Red Crescent will receive money from the DREF based on this forecast to do things to prepare people living along that river. So this has been a big win. And the United Nations is experimenting with setting up a similar fund. Their DREF equivalent is called SURF, the Central Emergency Response Fund. And the SURF has now opened up a window for early action and used it actually recently in Bangladesh. That's an exciting example of when this happened. And we also see this in NGOs. So NGOs that do disaster response have also started talking a lot about early warning, early action. The START network has a new fund that they have now made available to the NGO network within the START network to use and to tap into when they are anticipating a disaster. So this has been very exciting. I have to say that the humanitarian sector has really stepped up and said, okay, we can put money based on a forecast. We can make this possible. Let's do it. And we are still learning about how well this works. So in terms of the plans, we are now writing early warning, early action plans with National Red Cross, Red Crescent societies all over the world. So this map can give you an idea of some of the places where we're working within the Red Cross Crescent movement. But then there are, of course, the UN organizations and the NGO sector make this map even bigger, which is kind of exciting. But here are a number of different hazards that we're working on preparing these early warning, early action plans for. And this is very exciting. And so we have had a number of disbursements where the plan was ready, the funding was ready, people were activated when there was a forecast. And we have seen some nice indications that we were able to do more with these early interventions and really make a difference for vulnerable people. So this is very exciting, and this has been an exciting agenda for us in the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center as a way of dealing with not only current climate extremes, but helping people set up systems so that we are more prepared to deal with future climate extremes. Heat waves, of course, has been a big one that we've been pushing in a number of places. Yeah, and so here's actually an example. So we did this piece of research just showing, this is an analysis of forecasts and how well we can forecast heat waves using global meteorological models. And you can see in dark red and sort of medium red are all these places where we can forecast heat waves very, very well. And so these are all places that should have an early action plan, especially if heat wave risk is increasing over time. We need more of these heat health early action plans to help save lives before heat waves actually happen. You'll see actually that there are a number of places in Africa that right now are showing as poor skill for heat wave forecasting. And I think this is partly because tropical places are harder to predict. So you can see that's actually quite consistent. Like if you look at Indonesia, it is more difficult to predict extreme heat in tropical areas because the heat happens so sporadically. But I think this is an area of, that is extremely understudied to understand what do heat waves even look like in these regions. Maybe they don't look the same as heat waves look like in Boston, for example. Maybe extreme heat is more longer duration heat. So a heat wave as defined in this study, and as you would define it here in Boston, would be like a 3-day extreme temperature event. But it could be that, in parts of Congo, it's really like a monthly temperature extreme that will cause issues for livestock or crops or people. And we need to start thinking about defining heat waves differently in tropical areas. But this is an area where really, I have to say, there's very, very little research. And there's so much risk. And we'd really love to see more research in this area, especially in light of a changing climate, right? Heat waves are one of the fastest changing risks in most places. So I'd love to just offer you a couple of the challenges that we've been dealing with forecast-based financing to also inspire you as researchers about things that you might want to look into. One is that there's very little verification information. This is a data sculpture we created with some data from a river in Togo, because there was a little bit of data from a hydropower dam on the River Mono in Togo to understand the flow and understand flood risk and understand, how can the dam manage the water in a way that decreases flood risk downstream and helps give early warnings to people who might be flooded downstream. But in most cases, had there not been this hydropower dam, there's often very little information to understand how well can we predict extreme events. So here I'm calling it verification information, but you can have these global models, for example, but you have very little information from the ground to know, is this forecast accurate? And we certainly don't want to be evacuating people all the time based on forecasts that aren't very accurate, right? So data scarcity has been a big issue for understanding forecasts and being able to use forecasts, and that's been a big barrier for us. I would say also some forecasts are not super related to extreme event impacts. So drought has been a big one that's been difficult. So this is a seasonal forecast that shows a 50% chance of below normal. But if you look at the graphs, here I'm graphing on the horizontal axis the phase of food insecurity, right? And the vertical axis is the probability of different outcomes given a drought index. And so what's very interesting, and I don't need to go into all the details of this figure, but what's very interesting is if you have a seasonal forecast that shows a 50% chance of below normal, or if you have no forecast, the probability, I'm going to toggle back and forth, the probability of these food insecurity outcomes is very, very similar, right? So seasonal forecasts are probably not telling us a lot about what's actually happening in the real world. People get food from all sorts of different ways, and there's a lot of wage labor, and market prices are very important. And so just looking at some random forecast of rainfall is not always enough to give us an indication of what kind of outcomes can we expect on the ground and what kind of early action should we take. So this has been another area of active research on our side that has been very difficult to figure out what forecasts can we use to anticipate food insecurity or other things like this, especially related to drought. On the horizon, I'd love to leave you with something exciting that we're calling, that is called impact-based forecasting. So this is a new area of research that actually I know that the South Africa Weather Service is very active in working on and delivering impact-based forecasts. In collaboration, the UK Met Office is another big leader in this. And the idea is that when we are giving weather forecasts, we need to start thinking about what the weather will do and not just what the weather will be. So for example, instead of forecasting 10 millimeters of rainfall, we need to start saying, we're forecasting road closures in these 3 places. And that would be very useful for an organization like the Red Cross so that we can, transport supplies to safe locations, and then once the roads close, we have the supplies where we need them, for example. And so impact-based forecasting goes that extra step of combining the weather information with societal information. And so that often means looking at different vulnerability information, looking at which houses are in flood-prone areas, et cetera, to understand what is the potential impact of this forecast and what kind of intervention do we need to do in advance of the event to try to help prevent impacts. So we've recently released guidelines on impact-based forecasting, and we're releasing a MOOC, one of those massive online courses, on the topic as well, to try to explain why we're excited about it and get more and more interest within the weather community, but also within the research community of people who understand vulnerability and understand risk, to help improve and develop impact-based forecasts around the world. We also have this fun series, and I won't go into all the details about what can go wrong, because forecast-based financing is a complex thing. You're using a forecast, it's uncertain. The whole thing is, and many things have gone wrong for us to try to anticipate disasters and work on climate risk management. I've pulled out one for you. This is a cartoon where someone is saying, "We've evacuated everyone, asterisk." By everyone, I mean everyone registered with us, signed up for our newsletter, and who follows us on Instagram. And you can see that there are some people, especially less connected people, who have not been evacuated. And one of the things that has been very difficult for us in looking at solutions and climate risk management is inequality. So there are some people who are not reached when we try to take early action, because maybe we don't know that they live there, we don't know that they're vulnerable, we don't know that they need to be evacuated or supported in some way. And I think this is true of broader climate risk management work as well. And this has been something that's been very difficult for us to try to navigate, because our mandate is to respond to need, right? And so if there are people who are going to have bigger needs, we need better systems for understanding what those needs are and how we can get there in advance. And that brings me to a specific group of people who I think are under-researched and underserved. This is people living in fragile contexts. So there are a lot of fragile contexts around the world, often subnationally, right, where there's armed conflict happening, or different reason, different areas of of difficult and low governance situations. And these places are chronically underserved when it comes to humanitarian support. And so they are, of course, supported by the ICRC, which works in conflict situations and helps in that way. But the climate field completely ignores fragile contexts. I have to say that certainly in terms of even our understanding of the physical climate in areas that are affected by conflict is very low. So you can see this is a map of weather stations around the world. And there's not a lot of data coming from fragile contexts. And this means that there's a lot of gaps. I mean, compare parts of Kenya with Somalia, for example. So we have very little understanding of the actual climate variables in a lot of these fragile contexts. And in terms of the effect on people, there have been some interesting studies showing that there's not a lot of research happening on climate change and climate change impacts on people in these fragile contexts. And so we're doing a study right now that actually looks at all the research in the world and looks at what's happening in fragile contexts. And there are very little studies. There are very, very few, if any, studies on climate change and Yemen, for example. And I put a teacup here because there are some indications that places that speak English or were previously colonized by the British do receive more attention and slightly more research than those who speak other languages. And so there is this spotlight effect on places that are easy to study, which leaves us with these big holes in our understanding of potential climate change impacts and what we should be doing about that in these fragile contexts. So I'd love to leave that with you as the area of potential research and need that we see in the world. So yeah, I'll take the last just couple minutes to leave you with a couple big research questions that would be fun to think about together with you, or feel free to take forward yourselves. On forecast-based financing, we have this research roadmap that you can find online if you like. I pulled out a couple of examples to show you here, but we have lots and lots of research questions, like how well do forecasts work? how can we best target the population who are at risk of the disaster? We've got lots of questions about funding mechanisms, local funding, global funding. Could they work well? When we take early action, are we actually helping anyone? You know, so if we gave a cash transfer to people before this flood, did that really work? Were they able to use the cash transfer, and were we able to reduce disaster impacts or not? There are lots of questions about policies, if people are interested in doing policy research. And so with forecast-based financing, we've got lots and lots of questions, early warning systems and things like this. But I would leave you with a couple other major pieces of work that our team does do. So one is heat waves, and I mentioned this earlier. So what do heat waves look like in places that are already hot, right? Is this, who do we need to be worrying about? Is it day laborers? Is it the elderly? Is it infants? Livestock? You know, what are the impacts of heat waves in understudied places? And what interventions best help vulnerable people? And, you know, how can we design interventions that are appropriate? So, you know, if we're telling people to drink water, but water sources happen to be contaminated for whatever reason, maybe we need to be providing water, right? To avoid negative impacts on people during these heat waves, for example. So there are lots and lots of heat wave related questions that we would love to see explored, especially in some of these understudied areas, and especially in tropical areas where we have very little understanding. Urban areas. So we're seeing that, you know, obviously people are urbanizing, secondary cities get very little research. What adaptation strategies are working well in these places? Who is very vulnerable? What policies need to be in place? And who is benefiting from which adaptation strategies? So urban areas are another major area of research that we're interested in. And lastly, climate policy. So we are active in international and national and local climate policy. The Red Cross will often represent vulnerable people and represent this humanitarian voice. And so, you know, some of the things that we advocate for are climate finance streams to try to reach the local level and reach, you know, civil society and not just sit with major UN organizations or whatever. But so how do we understand climate finance flows, what works for vulnerable people, what factors and what setups can help actually make that reach the ground, and what we call the last mile. What adaptation solutions have been benefiting which people? Why or why not? So there are lots of climate policy questions that we also have and we would love to explore. And with that, I think that is where I will leave you. And I would love to have a discussion. I can stop sharing my screen. I'd love to have a discussion and hear all of your thoughts. Yeah, all of your thoughts and ideas and questions and offers about forecast-based financing, of course, I took a little bit of a deep dive on that, but other things that we work on as well.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was enormously, I mean, I must say it's a little daunting, all the research that is still required, but it is so inspiring to see this sort of local action and a really humanitarian, proactive approach to dealing with disaster risk. I sort of have 3 pages of scattered scribbled notes in front of me, but particularly striking to me is once again picking up on Mark's keynote and also on Gabriel and Daniel were speaking about, is this sort of this transdisciplinarity that meets intersectionality, and how important that is, but how we can really only do that when we have researchers on the ground, whether those be local research participants, you know, as capacity building projects, whatever it might be, giving us data or generating data in these data poor areas. So I do hope all the early career researchers in the audience were also taking furious notes, yeah, with some very, very clear areas of need indicated. I'd like to open up the floor and not dominate discussion. I'd like to open up the floor if there are any questions or comments. If anyone seeing any of this relate to their own work, not necessarily just the presenters, but the panelists, any kind of implications you see for your own work on what Erin's just presented. And I'm just quickly navigating between the participants and the chat. Here I see a question from Ngunjiri Ngandu. Do you have to go to engineering solutions? I think this could enter into pre-stage and possibly attract funds. And now the questions just quickly popped off my screen again somehow. Did you catch that?
I think so. It's a good question, and now I'm realizing there's a Q&A separate from the chat. That's cool.
Yes, I also just.
Yeah, so we do, especially when we're talking about urban areas, right? I think there is a big role for engineering solutions. You know, the Red Cross, you know, historically might not be the group that's actually building an engineering solution. You probably want engineers to do that. But a lot of what we do is advocate for such solutions. And so, you know, at a municipal level, for example, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Society will sit on, you know, on meetings and on the boards of things and say essentially, no, we are not comfortable with this type of development in this area, or we do need more cooling centers in this region. Otherwise, people are not able to access cooling centers or whatever it is, and try to push and influence development in that way. But yeah, I mean, I have to tell you, I think engineering solutions are a very important part of the picture, for sure.
Joyce, I see your hand is up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin, for the nice presentation. So what I wanted to ask is, so how do you deal with the challenge of funding a forecast that doesn't come to pass? So say you're funding for a flood that was forecasted or a drought, and you've put money into these and there's a plan for that, and there's action for that. There's like planned action for that. And the event doesn't actualize. So how do you deal with such a challenge? Do you try to sort of like work with the forecasters to improve the forecast next time, or what have you been doing to deal with that challenge?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so what we do is, so if you're acting based on a forecast, by definition, we are taking some risk, right? That the event might not happen. And so what we require in all of the early action plans is for people to explain, based on every forecast that they're going to use, what is the probability of acting in vain? And so you can calculate this, you know, looking at the forecasts, and what we want to make sure is that the actions that we're taking are proportional to the strength of the forecast. So if there's a very strong forecast that's like 90% chance of major flooding, then we do think it's appropriate to evacuate, and you know that 10% of the time we will evacuate in vain. But you know, if the forecast is saying, oh, there's a 50% chance of a flood, we might not choose evacuation as the choice there. And so what we try to do is make the action proportional to the probability of the forecast. And you know, and we do act in vain, it happens. And the example I like to use is, because it's local to where I live, I lived in New York City during Hurricane Sandy, which was one of the bigger extreme events that New York has experienced. But 2 years before Hurricane Sandy, we were hit by a hurricane called Hurricane Irene. And so there were a lot of forecasts and there was a lot of hype about Hurricane Irene, and people were evacuated in New York City. And it turned out that then Irene did not actually hit the city, it hit nearby. So this was action in vain, and you know, pretty expensive, difficult, painful actions like evacuating people. But then, you know, 2 years later, we had another forecast, and here comes Sandy, and everyone said, well, we still need to evacuate again, right? We know forecasts aren't perfect, but you know, it is worth it to save the lives, even though sometimes you will do it in vain. And of course, Sandy did hit New York and did cause a lot of destruction. So you know, part of the point here is that we need to be figuring out ways of acting on probability, which is tough.
Thanks for that great question, Joyce. Romaric, I see your hand is up.
Hello. Thank you, Erin, for your presentation. I have a quick question, which is based on the frustration of an African scientist from Niger for the recent flood in Niamey, which put down all the flood control system already in place. And what was even more painful was that flood control system was recently upgraded. So, but just after the upgrade, that scientist, part of a group, they did a simulation over the region showing an extreme case scenario of flood that could have destroyed all the system. And that has been presented to the policymakers, but unfortunately no action has been taken in order to prevent such very extreme scenario. So don't you think also that sometimes it's not about necessarily the information that are out there or the quality of the forecast, but also a kind of political will in terms of improving the disaster control system around our town and cities?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So interestingly, the Red Cross in Niger they were in the process of preparing their early action plan at the time of these floods in Niamey. So they did do some sandbagging of the river, which was, you know, I'm proud that they did do that, but I think they could have done more. And I think that was also a question of political will, right? Like, again, people not knowing what is appropriate to do and, you know, not having everything set up properly with the plan and the financing and everything. So I agree with you. I mean, I think it's a very difficult and tricky issue, right? Part of it is also, you know, people's willingness to invest in risk reduction. So, you know, the Netherlands is probably the country in the world that is most willing to spend lots of money and invest in risk reduction. They build these flood barriers all over the country for very, 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 you know, they cannot possibly be broken unless it was like the most extreme 1 in 10,000 year flood. And most people and countries don't do that. And there is no political will to build for the 1 in 10,000 year flood, certainly not even where I live in the United States at all. And so one research question that is on our list is, you know, how do you motivate people to make investments and say, look, this risk of all of our barriers failing and risk of extreme events is worth acting on now. It is worth investing in. It is worth spending money on, and that's really hard, I have to say. I think, you know, what you said about doing simulations of the extreme events can often be helpful because then people can see the potential impact because they have a simulation. But it sounds like in this case, you said they had the simulation and people still were not willing to invest further. And so that's hard. I don't have all the answers on that one. Certainly interdisciplinary research on how to encourage people to reduce risks is necessary. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I was going to, it's a nice way to end sort of a bookend to our three keynotes. You know, we sort of mark with research and data and interdisciplinarity, and Gabriel and Daniel speaking about sort of activism, grassroots stuff. And I feel like yours was a combination of how do we use data to get to the people on the ground. And then of course there's this firewall or this wall that we so often hit, is the political will to in fact do anything. And I am aware of time, so I don't want to use sort of my powers as chair to sort of too freely to go too far into the next presentation slot. But it is, I was going to ask, is there ever a moment where you where you don't present it as sort of climate related, just to sort of get around that, especially where you are, where there's such denialism in the political structures?
Yeah, sure. I think there are definitely techniques in the United States. I mean, if you talk about disaster risk, it's not political. If you talk about climate change related disaster risk, it is political. So yeah, talking about disaster risk can make sure that you're getting through and not causing political issues. The Red Cross is a non-political organization. I mean, we are not partisan. We are neutral, impartial. So that also helps. We are focused on disaster risk. We are focused on people who are going to be impacted. You know, if climate change is happening, we need to take that into account. Sorry, but this is our job. And I think people get that. I think that's been good. But yeah, I mean, mustering the political will to invest in disaster risk reduction is hard. And I think we've played with a lot of techniques, you know, for example, to try to get people to make this fund that's available based on forecasts, right? They didn't have to do that. They could say, no, we're only giving you money if there are people who are in need. Sorry, you work on needs. If they're not in need yet, no money. And that's, you know, that's the typical answer you get, right? And so I think we were able to be quite persuasive by showing how much more effective you could be if you spent the money in advance compared to after. So there were a lot of, you know, effectiveness arguments saying if you give people a cash transfer in advance, or if you evacuate them in advance, you will be much more effective and you will have a bigger impact. And donors like that for sure. We also, you know, we did do different simulation things. We developed some different games for people to like play through simulations and some sort of out of the box methods for communicating and inspiring people to really try to push this agenda forward. And so that would be the other thing I would say is in policy discourses, you really have to be creative, think outside the box, you know, try to wow people, try to inspire people so that then they say, yes, really, I feel a lot of I feel a lot of my own impetus to do this thing and to follow through for sure.
Thank you so much, Erin. I think that's a very valuable talk for anyone working in the climate change field to hear, but I hope that's given a little bit of talk yesterday about balancing hope and urgency. So thank you for helping us do that. Thank you very much, Erin. Have a fantastic day further.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Good luck to all of you, and please do reach out. You know, I'd be happy to leave my email in the chat.
Please.
You know, yeah, please do. Please reach out, and you know, we try to partner with universities. We really love working with researchers. So you know, if you have ideas or we're just, you know, would like to work with us, let me know. So thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your conference. Okay, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.